Hi, I'm Vas Vasiliadis, and in this talk, I'm going to share some thoughts on how national facilities and actually many other types of organizations are managing data at scale using a design pattern that we call the Modern Research Data Portal. First, a little history. So, if you go back just a few short decades when I was in high school, perhaps, and many folks at that time were worried about the aliens, maybe you weren't one of those, but you're probably in the many groups of people that are really concerned about how to manage the volumes of data nowadays that are coming off these high resolution instruments like advanced light sources, DNA sequencers, Zeiss light sheets, and so on. So we have a number of these instruments available to researchers around the world in national facilities, in universities, in private enterprise as well. And getting data off these instruments and making it available to others for analysis and distribution is quite a challenge. And at Globus, we'd like to think that we have helped address this challenge somewhat by allowing people to easily move data between different resources. We recently crossed the 1 exabyte mark for the amount of data moved. And this is typically done by people pointing and clicking in a web app and moving their data, and then also sharing it with people that don't typically have access to that local system. So this is a very important feature in collaborative research, and I guess all research is collaborative nowadays. So this is really critical, being able to make data available to others outside your own institution. So we can do this quite easily, as I said, with a web application, but this whole point and click approach really scales only up to a point. Beyond that, if you want to address a situation like this, which is something that we see very commonly, right? I have an instrument that is generating data. I have a number of users that are sharing access to this instrument. So they give me a set of samples to sequence, or they bring some tissue for to put through some high resolution X-ray beam, and the data that gets generated then needs to be pulled off the instrument, moved typically to some other type of storage. Then we need to set policies about who can access that data, such that those researchers and their collaborators can come and find it and do analyses and perhaps share it with the broader community. So very common design pattern, and there's a number of capabilities that are required for this. And we have a way to automate all of this. And this is really critical when you start talking about instruments like the advanced photon source at Argonne, which I'm going to use in a number of examples that I'll talk about later on. So this is a facility with 30 plus beam lines, I think it is now, and the challenge is when one of these beam lines is operating, it can easily generate over 100 terabytes a month. And that was a number that was sort of in play about 4 years ago. I think with the current upgrades that are being worked on right now, we're going to see maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude increase as a result of the higher resolutions that are going to be available to researchers. So pulling the data off the instrument is important, but making it easily discoverable and accessible by collaborators and often by a much larger community is really the thing we want to do here. And so I mentioned that Globus is sometimes used or often used through a web application, but there are other interfaces. There's a command line interface that can be used to script transfers and to automate to some degree sharing of data in a very simple manner. But then really what people have gone out and built is these large custom solutions to automate the process end to end. And a good example of this is the D-Magic effort that was led by Francesco Di Carlo a few years ago. But even then, these bespoke solutions only get us so far. So in about 2016 or so, the very smart folks at ESNet out at Berkeley National Lab, together with some of the Globus team, presented this idea of the Modern Research Data Portal. And I'm going to talk about what this is and describe a few of the deployments that are currently in production use as a means of illustrating how large-scale data management should be done, at least in our opinion. So the Modern Research Data Portal, or MRDP, design pattern comprises 4 elements. Underpinning everything is the Science DMZ, which provides a nice clean data path between different data transfer nodes, which are ideally servers that are designed for moving large volumes of data efficiently. And then we have Globus Connect, which is a piece of software that makes diverse storage systems accessible to this solution. And bringing it all together are services in the Globus platform that allow you to orchestrate this data movement, sharing, description, discovery, and so on. So you might be asking yourself, well, what's wrong with my LRDP, my legacy research data portal? Well, in response, I'll offer a quote from Charles Kettering, who was a prolific inventor and the head of research at General Motors back in the 20s and 30s. And he said, if you're doing something the same way you've been doing it for 10 years, chances are you're doing it wrong. And what does that mean in the context of the data portal? Well, doing it wrong, at least from our perspective, means that you have both the portal logic itself as well as the data that that portal is serving all sitting behind an enterprise firewall. And that's not a very efficient way for getting data out of these repositories. The emerging sort of best practice for this is to have a Science DMZ which separates out the data path so that you can actually have the portal logic sitting behind the enterprise firewall, because that does offer some additional levels of fine-grained security and access control. But then have the data path be through the Science DMZ that allows this nice clean flow of data, because the data portal only moves small amounts of data. It's business logic at things like authenticating lists of results and so on. But then when you actually have to get the files themselves, hundreds of gigabytes, terabytes, what have you, you use the green path here. And as I said, in these Science DMZs, we have ideally a cluster of data transfer nodes, or even just one. But these are machines that are built specifically for the purposes of moving data. And for details, I'll refer you to the reference there in the on the ESNet website at fasterdata.es.net. The third piece, as I mentioned, is Globus Connect. And Globus Connect is software that allows you to access not only POSIX compliant file systems, but increasing numbers of object stores, archival systems. This is a list of the systems we currently support. We also have a number under development. We're about to release support for the iRod system, and then also have planned support for Microsoft Cloud Services as well as Dropbox. But the fourth piece is where I really want to focus the majority of our discussion here, which is on the components that are needed to effectively orchestrate getting data off an instrument, ingesting it into some index to make it more easily discoverable, potentially computing on it in various ways, and making both the raw data as well as the downstream computed or analyzed products available, so that others in the community or others in your research collaboration can come along, search for the data, find them, move them, and further analyze them themselves, and being able to do this at scale. So some of the services that we provide in the Globus platform that make this possible are listed here. I'm going to focus on just a handful of these, in particular the Globus Auth service, the Globus Transfer service, the Search service, and then the Automate service as well. So underpinning everything is the Globus Auth service, which is a foundational, as we call it, foundational identity and access management service, which enables you to authenticate not just to Globus itself, but to any other services in an ecosystem that deploy this mechanism for authentication and access control. So the idea is that you can protect your APIs and your applications and allow flows between those applications, and not just Globus and those applications, but between the applications and services themselves, and have all of that controlled via the Globus Auth service. And very importantly, we don't want people having to create new identities, usernames, and passwords on every system they access. So in the vast majority of cases, you can use an existing identity from one of our list of over 1,000 trusted identity providers, and that list grows literally daily. Very importantly, it employs a least privileges security model, which means that the application or the user for that session are granted only the permissions that they need, no more, no less, to do the thing that they're trying to do. And that's sort of a best practice in general as far as security goes. And all of this is built on the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect standards. In fact, all the flows within Globus Auth are standard OAuth 2 flows. So if you're familiar with those, you'll know exactly what to expect. And this also makes it possible for you to leverage this type of framework with a number of different programming languages, with libraries from Google, as well as from many other providers, including our own SDK. The other key service is the Globus Search service. So this is a service that allows you to pull metadata in without concern for specific schemas. So you can define whatever schema makes sense for your purposes, present that to the Globus Search service. It will ingest that, it will create an index, and at the same time it will apply the same fine-grained access control through Globus Auth to ensure that people that come along and search for data using that index are only able to see the metadata that they're authorized to see. And the search capability is very robust in that it not only provides the sort of plain text, simple search, if you will, but it also provides faceted search and has a very comprehensive query language that you can use to build arbitrarily complex and interesting queries. So Globus Search and Globus Auth are just two of the services that get pulled together through the Globus Automate platform. And this is where our current focus is in development. We're building out this ecosystem that allows you to automate data management across diverse systems and instruments, facilitating computation at various points, and also allowing human intervention when required. So this is a little bit of an eye chart, but the key takeaway here is that you have a number of different resource types on which we need to perform actions. We need to move data from storage systems. We need to kick off analysis jobs on HPC resources. We need to describe data and put it into repositories. We need to present data for people to discover and do downstream analysis with. All of those kinds of flows are facilitated by this infrastructure. And we call them flows, and they are basically sequences of actions that are triggered based on certain events. So a file coming off a DNA sequencer or a new sample being run through an advanced light source will trigger some downstream actions. And I've got a number of examples that will illustrate this. So all of this is built on top of a service called AWS Step Functions. So it provides a declarative way to state what the actions are and what events will trigger them. And what we've done is we've provided an API that allows you to build these so-called action providers, these things that will initiate various actions on the underlying resource. And everything here again is secured using Globus Auth. So here are some of the action providers that we have available so far. The ones with the blue border are ones that we have developed as part of the Globus service. So they do straightforward things like move some data, identify some data, allow searching for some data, and so on. And then we have some additional action providers. I'm going to talk about a couple of these later on that, for instance, allow you to submit a compute job as a function. That's the funcX service, or automatically extract metadata using the Xtract service. So next up, I have a couple of examples from the Advanced Photon Source, and the Argon Leadership Computing Facility. The first of these is a project that does X-ray photon correlation spectroscopy, or XPCS. So this is a group that studies the dynamics in materials at nanoscale by looking at correlations between time series of data as detected by a light beam. So the flow here is that they put a sample on a light beam at the APS. So the imaging takes place, data is pulled off that instrument, it's moved to the Argon Leadership Computing Facility, where they run a piece of software called XPCS Eigen. And then that generates a plot of the results. They use that then to feed into an ingest process that extracts metadata and the plots and publishes them into a search catalog on the Petrel storage system. This is a petascale storage system also operated by the ALCF. And then that goes into sitting in front of that is an example of the modern research data portal, which allows other researchers to come along and discover data and do their own thing, and hopefully science happens, right? So this is what the underlying automate flow looks like. You can see the various action providers there, and this is a relatively straightforward sequences, a couple of transfers, a couple of invocations of the funcX action provider to run compute jobs, and then pushing data out and setting access control, setting policy for people to view the results. Along similar lines, but in a slightly more complex flow, is the Neurocartography example. This is a group run by Bobby Kasturi, where they're building a map of the connectome, the neurons, the connections in the brain. So what they do is they take images of mouse brains, actually not human brains yet. They run those again through a light beam at the APS. Here we have a couple of different steps within the APS facility. They pull the data off and do some pre-processing before again sending it off to ALCF. But then the first piece of computation results in an image that a user looks at to validate that in fact the beam is properly focused and everything is set up correctly before they run the full experiment. And once that's confirmed, then they pull all the images together, run some reconstruction algorithms, and then push that out to storage. And then the same portal is used to find the data by others and compute on it and so on. The flow here, as I said, is a little more complex because one of the important things that sits in the middle of this is the minting of an identifier. So each of these data sets gets its own DOI, and that makes it easier and sort of more persistent as far as being able to discover it downstream and also cite it in derivative works. The third example, which is also an Argon example, this is slightly different in that it doesn't involve a light source, but this is a case where a group at the Materials Data Facility, the MDF, are curating, they're assembling and curating many thousands of data sets related to materials. So this is things that, data sets that describe various materials properties that can facilitate materials research. So they accept data from various other groups who submit the data through a web form. That kicks off a flow whereby someone looks at it at the MDF. They add metadata to it. They augment the metadata that's automatically extracted from the data. They push that out to a catalog that then is also again available for people to search. So this is an even more complex flow, but the important difference here is that you have both human intervention in the process of curation, as well as a couple of different areas where you're adding metadata and augmenting that metadata through automated means. And so I've mentioned the portal that's used to access these data sets. So this is actually another service that is available to various groups that use the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. The portal is called petrel.data.net, and this is a shared data service that allows the presentation of data and the search and discovery of data from any number of projects, and all of that is governed by Globus Auth for a fine-grained access control. So you can make a data set completely public, or you can choose to restrict it to just your immediate collaborators or some other group, some slightly broader community. It's really up to you. The only thing that's required is that the person trying to access that is in the appropriate group in the Globus service, such that the appropriate policies can be applied. So what I'd like to do is give you a better feel for what all of this looks like. So let's do a quick walkthrough of the petrel.data.net service. So this is the portal, and you can see here some of the data sets that I was talking about. Here is the XPCS project up in the top left. Down here is the Neurocartography project. And here is the materials data facility. And I'm going to access that. First thing I'm going to do is log in. And login uses Globus Auth. So you can see here I'm using an existing credential, my identity at the University of Chicago. So I can click that, get redirected to the University of Chicago to log in. That just flashed right back because I had already logged in recently. So now I'm able to go and search for some data in the MDF. And you can see here an example of the faceted search. So the data sets have been ingested. Metadata has been automatically extracted. These facets were created as part of the index that's maintained by Globus Search. So I can select some subset of the data and you'll see the results changing. And then when I'm ready to, I can look at a data set in more detail. So I can look at additional metadata, and then I can click on the Globus link to get the data, and that will send me over to the Globus service, which will then allow me to move that set of data over to some other endpoint of my own choosing. So the last thing I'd like to talk about are a couple of the projects that we're currently working on in the Globus labs. One of those is funcX, which is functions as a service for HPC. So basically this service allows you to transform your own cloud, a private cloud, a cluster, a supercomputer, into a high-performance function serving system. So you deploy the funcX service, you deploy an endpoint in the service, and that turns the computer into a function serving device so that users can request that code be executed either via Docker or Shifter or Singularity containers. And it supports multiple different APIs and many diverse types of compute resources, as I mentioned, clusters, clouds, and so on. So that's one very important piece that comes into play as part of these automate flows. And the other piece, which relates to ingest of data for indexing and search, is the Xtract service, which is a way for dynamically extracting metadata in a sort of a pipeline fashion. So you can decide whether to do that in some centralized site, or you can do it at the edges based on data coming off of the instrument. So you can trade off either computing costs versus the cost of moving data to some centralized place before doing the ingest. So this is another service that we currently have in development and in limited deployment. So all of these services, as well as some others which I didn't talk about in this presentation, come together to provide a very scalable mechanism or set of scalable solutions for managing data at not only national facilities, as I said early on, but also any environment where you have large volumes of data that require automation for efficient management. And in closing, I'd like to say just a few words about what Globus is, because sometimes we're mistaken for a commercial software company. We're a group at the University of Chicago that develops and operates this service on behalf of the research community as a non-profit entity. And our mission is to help researchers everywhere, including those in many commercial companies who are also using Globus, and to do so in a sustainable way. And sustainability is really core to our mission. Development of the service is funded by many of the federal agencies as well as other donors, and we are really grateful to them for their support. But a very important part of continuing to operate the service is to have funding which comes to us from many subscribers that pay annual subscriptions, and we are very grateful to them as well for ensuring that the service is available to researchers for the long term. And I'll close with a number of links where you can learn more about Globus and hopefully start using it. Thank you.